Welcome to the Code for Couples podcast, focusing on topics for law enforcement officers and couples to keep you and your relationship connected, resilient, and code for. Now, your host, law enforcement expert Cyndi Doyle, author of Hold the Line and My Wife.
Hey there, and welcome back to Code for Couples. This is Cyndi, your host. Today, I'm excited to have on Dr. Katherine Kuhlman. She has been in the public eye a little bit lately because she has been talking about mass shootings and been on like Fox and Newsmax and some really awesome news outlets, but speaking for us as law enforcement families. And I'm just thrilled to have her on. Let me introduce you to Katie just a little bit. Katie is a board certified psychologist in police and public safety. And in Arizona, she does 100% of her work with first responders and their agencies in a variety of capacities. And works with families after critical incidences, not only in officer-involved shootings, but also in mass shootings, which is why I wanted to bring her on to talk. She has presented nationally on wellness issues related to wall enforcement, law enforcement, as well as school safety issues, and served as a subject matter expert on traumatic stress served as a subject matter expert on traumatic stress on the Colorado Governor's Expert Emergency Epidemic Response Committee before she moved to Arizona. Katie, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you being willing to talk about this really hard subject.
Oh my gosh, I'm so thrilled and honored to be here. So I'm excited to meet you and to be a part of this amazing podcast. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's, I can't, so let me start. I said this on the podcast right before, and I said, I am a little still jet lagged because I got in from Hawaii. And so I'm on Hawaii time and I'm just not awake yet. So we're moving on and doing that. We have been through a lot of mass shootings lately, and I was reading something from the American Counseling Association that was citing the number of mass shootings that we have had this year in the United States. And I was shocked because I was like, that can't be right. And I went in and I looked at the definition, and I always read what people cite as far as their statistics, because I'm always one of those skeptics that's like, statistics can prove anything. But in essence, by the definition of mass shootings, we've been through a lot. And then as far as law enforcement and being as a first responder family, and if you're a spouse or an officer, have friends in the field, it impacts us differently. And we go through, I think, some different scenarios in our head. I think fear becomes more prevalent, and it's not the same as it was 10 years ago, I'll even say. So I know we wanted to talk today about extreme events and how that these extreme events are different from officer-involved shootings or critical incidences. What makes something an extreme event?
So, I think that the biggest difference, when we think of critical incidents, we think of course, the officer-involved shootings, fatal motor vehicle accidents, sex assault cases, child deaths, you name it, right? And I think that officers are very well trained when it comes to handling those situations, right? I mean, that's something that you go through in the academy, right? You shoot often. I mean, I'm in the Phoenix area, so our officers draw their firearms quite a bit. I feel like every week I'm debriefing an officer involved shootings. Like it's just part of the job at this point. And honestly, I think 100% of the debriefs of officer involved shootings I've done, I don't know that any officer has ever felt bad about their shooting. Like it's been other factors that have led to them feeling traumatized. But when we think of extreme events, these are events that have typically a higher body count. And they are events that officers can't necessarily train for. Of course, officers do active shooter training, but there is nothing that can, I think, mentally prepare an officer for what they will encounter if they are going to walk into a school shooting, for example. I used to work in Colorado, and of course, Columbine is in Colorado. And so because of that, some of the officers there, I think, are probably better trained than in other places I've seen. And what they did was they actually converted a school into an active training center, active shooter training center, where they would pump in the smell of gun smoke. They would hire actors and children to basically be bleeding and crying out for help as officers are entering the school, because nobody realizes that, when officers first enter a school or, any kind of building where there's an active shooter, their goal is to neutralize the threat. It's not necessarily to save people. And so what parent, right? So many officers are parent. How can they possibly be, stepping over dead bodies, kids crying for help, and have to ignore them, right? That's one of the hardest things. And so I think that's actually one of the most traumatic things about these extreme events is that your senses are completely overloaded.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just the senses being completely overloaded. It's the idea of the task at hand is one that maybe not just that others might not understand, but that your body has to resist going, identifying and taking care of those immediate situations, because the immediate situation is actually the shooter at the time. Right. We originally connected right after the shooting in Uvalde, which, because I'm in Texas, was very, I'm not physically close to home, but Texans are very, we support Texans, right? We're very proud. And so there was a lot of support that came from it, but there's also a lot of criticism that comes, and those armchair quarterbacking, if you will, that comes as part of it. So I think there's two things I want to address here is the idea that officers are under a microscope right after, and I'm going to suggest maybe even during the situation. And then also the spillover impact on the families that are going through the incident. If they know that something's going on, especially in a community like a smaller community where these seem to be popping up, it's not just major cities. It's not like Dallas or Houston, Uvalde, small community. And so word travels fast. There becomes trauma for the community as a whole, but then also the criticism of how situations were handled. So how do officers, or what's the spillover that happens after these extreme events in regard to the officers that participated or didn't participate on the event, and then also their families?
Well, I think that's such a good point. When you have these extreme events, the medical footprint compared to the psychological footprint is much smaller, right? The psychological footprint includes, all of the people who were on scene, the officers who weren't on scene. And having worked a number of mass casualty incidents, I can tell you that a lot of times officers who weren't present wish they were. They could be at home and they want to show up. And if they're working they just want a task and they want to be a part of it because, right, that's what they're drawn to do. And then, of course, it impacts the family members of officers because, of course, they're going to be worried about their officer going into that building. Who knows what's happening? Are they going to be injured? What are they going to encounter? What are they going to be like when they come home? Are they going to come home?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Are they going to be changed? Because we've heard so many stories of officers who deal with these incredibly traumatic mass casualty situations, and they're never the same. They come
Right.
back home, and one of the best examples that I can give you is following the Aurora Theater shooting. And there was a Sergeant Mike Hawkins was responsible for carrying out the youngest victim of
Mm.
the shooting, who was a 6-year-old girl. And he's done a number of interviews. He medically retired follow a couple of years after the shooting, but in his interviews he talks about how he had a 6-year-old daughter at home, and it was so hard to tuck her into bed at night
Oh,
because
yeah.
all he would see was this little girl. Her name was Veronica. And you, of course, as a family member, you don't want that. You want the husband or the wife that you married, and not necessarily a shell of a person or somebody who's going to just have an entire personality change. And then of course
Mm-hmm.
children too are incredibly impacted, because they worry about the safety of their officer parent. And they don't always have the just the cognizance that maybe an adult would have regarding the training that they have. And so they, then you start to see separation anxiety. I mean, right, it just kind of keeps going on and on and on.
Yeah, it's a
People
huge
get
ripple
scared
effect.
to, yeah, huge.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And then I think of also kind of that it's not a secondary, like we would call like secondary traumatic stress or something, but it's almost like a secondary trauma when you have a community that is potentially second guessing how things were handled. And that's what I was mentioning, like the armchair quarterback aspect of we have the criticism over social media, but then also the media, because I think about, once again, I'm just going to pick on the Uvalde situation and how that's just gone on and on and on. And now it's like criticism after criticism. How does that criticism then impact the officers involved in the event, in the extreme event, or the family involved in the extreme event? What are you seeing?
So, I mean, I think it's huge. And that's, of course, the case in any critical incident, is that there's always some second guessing, by the media, by the people in the community. And I think in most cases, right, it's kind of unfounded. It's a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of trolls. But then we have these situations where, right, that, I mean, there's been investigations, and they've noticed that some things went wrong. And I've been very careful in my interviews about it to not say anything negative about the police department, because I don't want what I say to impact those officers, right? That's what I care about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But you have to think, like, they hear what's going on. And I just think about those officers who were present, and the most difficult situation that they were in. How do you choose to, you've got your chief telling you to do one thing, and probably your gut telling you to do the other. And how do you choose?
Yeah.
How do you, you're thinking like, I want to keep my job. I don't want to make the wrong decision. I've got somebody who's been in the field longer than me, that's been doing this longer than me. I mean, that there's so much running through your head. And so I don't think it's fair to criticize the line officers in this shooting at all. I think, but a lot of them are feeling a lot of heat. And because there was such a loss, right? Families grieve, and
Absolutely.
people want justice.
Yes.
And if they're, and they want justice quick, they don't want to wait a long time for it. In the Aurora Theater trial, it took 5 years to go to trial. And that was 5 years of lawsuits, because the people that lost, their loved ones, they wanted justice, and they wanted it now. They weren't going to wait 5 years. And so you're going to see lawsuits, just come out of the woodwork right away. You're going to see so much criticism of the officers, and then they're going to take that to heart. I mean, how guilty must they feel? Like, they feel like they have these lives that are rested on their shoulder, like it's their fault. It's not their fault. There's one person whose fault this is, and it's the shooter.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
but these off, because they're good people, right? They take on so much of the pain, and they take on so much responsibility in these situations, that they feel at fault. And my concern, and I hope they're getting the help they need. I hope they have support in Uvalde, and these officers are, I hope they're all like doing debriefings, and I hope they're getting treatment. my fingers are crossed.
I was
don't
going to say
know,
fingers
right?
crossed for sure.
But my biggest fear is that we will lose by the end of the year. We'll lose some of them because this is
Right.
a huge weight to bear.
Yeah, it's the second guessing, when you think about, you were just talking about the idea of like, okay, we got to go take care of the shooter because that is the active threat, and then pushing through some of those gut reactions. And the second guessing, when you have all these other people second guessing you, it's hard, and it's hard to figure out how to support. What are some of the reactions that officers and spouses usually have after an extreme event?
So a lot of times they're similar to critical incidents. So, I mean, you can expect, irritability, isolation, and withdrawal, an increase in substance use, which of course is never good. But we know that officers sometimes drink to cope, and as we all do. I mean,
spouses do too.
We all do. Yeah. I mean, it happens, right? That's the reality of it.
Right.
But what happens in these types of events is people's comfort zones shrink, and that's going to go for officers, their spouses, the family, because then they start to believe that the world is not safe.
Right.
This is not just, a traumatic event. This was something big that impacted you, your family, and your entire community, right? You're going to have friends and family calling you from all over the country, wondering what's happened, what's going on. They're going to want to know information. You're going to be just overwhelmed with people asking questions, but also people offering support. And that can be a lot too, when all you want to do is just spend time with the people that you care about. And so you also may notice, like I said before, kids with kind of separation anxiety, not wanting to leave their parents' side, not wanting to leave the house very much, not wanting to go out in public, especially when it comes to schools, like fear of sending your kid to school. And especially, right, school just started, at least it did here. And
Here
so,
too.
right. Yeah. And so if you just experience something like that and you're sending your kid back to school, like as a parent, how do you sit through the workday those first couple of days without being an absolute anxious mess?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different reactions. I mean, and obviously, right, nightmares, flashbacks, stuff like that. The second guessing is huge because I think in any active shooter situation, something's going to go wrong because they're all so unique, and it's not something that you can fully plan for. And so there's always going to be something wrong that needs to be, I think, normalized.
Yeah. And you're mentioning all the symptoms or signs, the normal process that your body and your mind is going to go through after an event like that. And of course, your brain, one thing that I always say to people is that your brain's there to keep you safe, not make you happy. And so a big part of it is that, okay, well, this happened in my community. And I think that's a big shocker, not just for officers, but for everybody in the community. And of course, people want to leave their kids home. My VA, my assistant that I have, she has talked about so she's a former officer, and she has talked about how she has trained her child differently during an active shooter situation and prepped him differently and she's like, I think all the kids should go through this prep, but she preps him differently. And I think that's what happens in our families too, not only in seeing that these events are happening in such a widespread capacity, like weekly, sadly, weekly, we are seeing something like this. And so it makes us all a little vigilant on how do we protect our kids? How do we protect ourselves? How do we keep ourselves safe? And many times what we do, and especially after, I think it was Aurora, was the movie theater, right? Aurora.
Yes.
And ever since then, like we have not been to a movie. Like my husband and I do not go to the movies because he's like, nope, not going there. You're sitting ducks. And so many times it winds up impacting how we as law enforcement families live, right? But we can't just not send I mean, I guess we could not send our sick kids to school. We could homeschool them all the time, but we don't always have that luxury, right? And so it's very much like a struggle in our mind to be able to move through it differently. Are there things that you recommend to law enforcement and to families to move through how their brain wants to keep themselves and shut them down and just lock them in a closet and everybody there?
Well, I think one of the best things to do, and like you said with your assistant, is how do you keep you, your family, and your kids safe in a relatively unsafe world? Of course, right? Officers they're trained to always, kind of look for the negative and look for lies, and they're used to dealing with all of the bad things in society, and so naturally, right, they're skewed in the way that they think because they interact with bad things more than good at work. And so sometimes I think just remembering that is really important. The fact that, like, your kid is probably safer at school than anywhere else. That's the reality. The base rate of a school shooting is so incredibly low. What can you do? Like, what tools can you give your kid so that they're safe? And I think active shooter drills are great. We did fire drills when I was growing up.
We did tornado drills growing up, where our butts were way up in the air and our head were on the ground. Yeah. I was like, I'm not sure how, like, looking back, I'm like, pretty sure the tornado would have just come in and taken us away, but it made us feel safe.
And like, there hasn't been a fire in a school, I think, that has killed a person since like the 1950s, right? So like fires in schools are like not the threat, yet we still train for them. And kids that are going through those drills, I don't know about you, but I don't recall ever being fearful, like thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die in a fire. As adults, because these mass shootings are kind of new to us, we have a different perspective than I think kids do. Like for kids, a lot of times the active shooter drills, it's like, oh, this is what we're training for. And so sometimes I think they're actually less fearful than adults are. But I think the more that you can teach your kids, and I have a good story about this too. And actually I'm presenting with this guy in a couple of months on this exact issue about how do we like respond psychologically to mass shootings. He was on the SWAT team that breached Columbine during that shooting, and has responded to a number of mass shootings since then, and is now a deputy chief still in Colorado. And since Columbine, one of the ways that he kind of created purpose from dealing with such a traumatic event was by just being very involved in active shooter training, making sure that his officers were the best trained. And he is a big part of that school that I was telling you about, where they run people through scenarios. And he travels all over the world talking about active shooter training. He has a daughter. He has two daughters, but he has included his daughter in active shooter training since she was little.
Oh, wow.
And as luck would not so much luck have it, she was at the Borderline bar when there was the shooting there in California.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this is what we'll be talking about at the conference is, I chatted with her after the shooting. She came back to Colorado. I went to his house and I sat with her, and she told me the way that she thought through this shooting was a testament to what her father had taught her, because she said, I heard the gunshots. Everybody around me hit the floor. I thought to myself, they're sitting ducks. They're going to get shot. I need to go. She's like, I ran into the back. I tried to hide in a refrigerator, but I wouldn't fit. I saw an attic. I ran up there. I heard everything happen below me, but I was safe. And I texted my dad right away. They had a code that they used if she was ever in a situation, and she sent it to him right away. Next thing you know, of course, he's on the phone with the law enforcement officers in California on his way over from Colorado. But you could not ask for a better scenario if your kid is in that situation, right? Because you can go through active shooter training once or twice, but it's just like self-defense. If you're not practicing it constantly, there's no muscle memory, and it's not second nature. But if it's constantly ingrained in you, then you're going to react appropriately in the situation.
I think that brings up you said a couple of things in that story that I think are worth mentioning. You mentioned purpose, and that he found purpose in designing a school, a program that can help people be more prepared, and a community almost being more prepared. And so finding a purpose was a way that he helped himself recover from this. We talk about post-traumatic growth, and post-traumatic growth is this concept of how do you grow out of a trauma that you've experienced. And so finding a purpose is really important. Do you want to talk more about purpose before I go on to my next point?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Like when we think about trauma, I mean, that's one of the signs of the best prognosis is if a person can find meaning and purpose to grow from that, because then they don't see themselves as a victim of that incident. They see themselves as something that can push an issue further. And we do see this. Like he's a good officer example. There's another officer that was shot in the line of duty who became very involved in their department's wellness program after he was shot. And certainly parents of victims of mass shootings, you may have seen Max Schlachter. His son Alex was killed in Parkland, so he's a big advocate and goes around talking. There's another father whose daughter was killed and started the I Love You Guys Foundation. There's Sandy Hook Promise. There's all of these.
That's what I was going to mention was that Sandy Hook, that some of the parents in Sandy Hook have really gone on to also find purpose in that way by speaking and educating and funds.
Advocating. And even some of them have gotten together to create reporting systems for schools. So there's a number of states that have adopted, for example, the Safe to Tell program, where it's an anonymous reporting app for parents and students. They put the link on the back of their school ID. And if there's a concerning social media post, you can screenshot it and submit it. Or if there's, bullying, or if you're worried that somebody's suicidal. And so, but that also includes like concerning social media posts, because we know that perpetrators of mass violence typically broadcast it in some way, shape, or form, and kids use social media. And so that's how it usually happens. And so again, like that's another way that people can develop purpose. And so that's so important after something like this.
It's also interesting, while that's developing purpose, it's this, once again, kind of this ripple effect, because I know because of those situations that there's been school counselors that have been able to thwart situations. And in fact, we had a school counselor come to one of our statewide conferences, and she, those stories don't get out there of how so many situations are thwarted because of students telling, people noticing, somebody is engaging or notices some behavior and then engages this person in a different way and is able to make a difference. So I think also kind of thinking about how can I educate myself, educate my kids? How can I make sure to empower myself? Because many times we feel helpless, so as we're sitting by, you had said, many times officers are just wish they could have been there to be involved to help. And I think that as a community, not just as law enforcement, but I think everybody, but is law enforcement too, as law enforcement families, if we can find a way to empower ourselves, to educate others, to get involved, to empower our kids to respond in a certain way, I think that helps in coping with the what if and what if this happens, because when we have some sort of agency or control, we wind up feeling like, okay, I can make a difference and maybe I can make an impact. The second thing that I wanted to mention was you had said that this, the child of the chief, I think you said.
Deputy chief, yeah.
Okay, the child of the deputy chief, they had a code word, you said. So there was a system in place to be able to communicate what was going on. What have you heard in regard to systems that law enforcement or law enforcement families put into place in these situations?
Well, I think it's great because it's something that only they would know. And the code phrase, it was something very benign, right? It wasn't like a 911. It wasn't anything like that, but it was something that only they would know. And only they would know. And I think that developing this, like you said, it gives people a little bit of control, and it's a quick way to communicate in a time of emergency that doesn't involve a phone call. And it just can allow people to respond and know in the moment without having to explain too much. Because as we know, when people are in crisis, right, our brains aren't working as well. We have a hard time getting the words out. We don't really always know exactly what's going on. And so I think that is one way to provide a little bit of ease of mind in a situation like that.
When officers are involved in not a mass shooting, but an extreme event, how best can spouses or families support their officers when they make it home?
I think it's important to recognize, right? So after a critical incident, for example, we know that it takes a little bit longer for officers to get back to their baseline. And so, right, as an officer comes home, asking them, to help bathe the kids right away is probably not helpful for them. They probably need some more decompression time.
Maybe just a little.
Just a little.
Yeah.
But in an extreme event, it's even more heightened. And because there's so much media attention surrounding these events, and they unfold over such a longer amount of time because the investigations take longer, and right, you've got way more witnesses, there's just more people to interview. There's a crime scene, all of it. It's going to be a rolling. It's basically like a rolling adrenaline rushes and dumps over weeks. And so as a spouse and as a family member, I think it's important to recognize that and to validate that. Now, does that mean that you just, forgive them of all household duties for a couple of weeks? Absolutely.
Free pass.
It's not a free pass. But I think acknowledging that, right, empathizing with that, validating that, recognizing that irritability may not be coming from a place that's, personal against you, but it's just that there's a lot of work stress. That can be important. If there's family members that are close by that can come in and kind of help out with other tasks, take advantage of it. And the good thing I think about a lot of departments when there's some kind of, extreme event like this is when peer support teams shine and rely on those department resources. Because, if you're struggling with childcare or food, I mean, a lot of peer support teams will make sure that you get those needs met. It's just a matter of asking. And so having a good understanding of what the department's resources are is huge. And I always encourage spouses too, to make sure that they have good relationships with other spouses in the department so that they can keep that line of communication open. I think as a spouse, probably one of the most anxiety provoking things when there's an event like this is that you don't have information.
Yeah.
You're, on the edge of your seat, just like kind of waiting to hear what's going on and what's the next thing. So having that communication is absolutely huge. And that's important for departments to know as well. If they're listening to this, if you're, command staff or executive level, making sure that information is getting out to officers and their families is critical.
Yeah, they have to know that. I also want to make sure that everybody listening understands and knows that spouses can also have a traumatic I can't think of it. Like spouses can also experience trauma, some kind of post-traumatic stress as a part of this too. And I think that's really important to mention that spouses can have post-traumatic stress, period. And it's not just a secondary traumatic stress. It is, you have a loved one involved with this. And so it's important for everybody to kind of keep an eye on each other. Children, you mentioned children and the impact on children. It's important for us to keep an eye on those kids as well. And so it's important to know that even though we're talking about, hey, the impact on the officer, that spouses and kids may also be impacted, and you may need to keep an eye out for their nightmares or how they're thinking or their fears. And keep in mind that it can be just more serious than just fear. And it may be something that they need to seek some treatment for. You need to get some counseling for. And if you're not familiar with some of those signs and symptoms, I will definitely put a link in. Katie, did you want to mention any of those signs and symptoms that we need to get help for if we see some of these things?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones that I see is those racing thoughts, or what we call intrusions, that it's like
Mm,
it's you're trying to go to bed at night and your brain won't just shut off because you're thinking about the incident, or the own impact on your own life. Or you're working in the middle of the day and that thought just pops in your head without even being triggered. So that's probably what I see the most. But especially if you're noticing, nightmares that are related to it, or you are quick to anger, you feel like you don't have control over your mood. If you notice just the urge to kind of withdraw, we call it dissociating, which is basically kind of like taking a break from reality and kind of numbing out. And we all do this to an extent. If you find yourself scrolling through social media for 2 hours on end, just like I was doing this last night, just like reels and TikTok to,
yep.
you just kind of keep going, or you put on a Netflix show but you're not really paying attention. You have no idea what's going on. You're just kind of zoned out. That's a sign that something's going on. You shouldn't be doing that a lot. And a lot of people don't realize that that's often a symptom of trauma. And it's important, if somebody is experiencing these symptoms, the earlier that you can get help, the better, because it's much easier
Absolutely.
to treat early on.
Yeah, I've told people that so many times, like the sooner you get treatment, the better, because there's been so much development in our field, in our counseling mental health field, in the treatment of post-traumatic stress. And it's an injury. We try to emphasize this over and over again, that it's an injury, it's not a disorder. And so getting help for that injury sooner rather than later helps it heal quickly and not become infected. I always think of it that way. So,
Right. It's kind of like like with a physical injury, sometimes if you go to PT right away, or you rest your leg,
right.
it's going to be okay. But if you wait too long and you aggravate it more and more and more over time, you're going to end up needing surgery. So what would you prefer?
Right. So I think we need to understand that these mass extreme events, keep calling them the wrong thing, that
Well, it's
these extreme events,
interchangeable.
interchangeable, that these extreme events are going to be a part of our world, and that we don't need to fear, in the sense that there's training, and there's lots of training involved. And the more muscle memory that our officers create, or that we can create, will help us to know what to do. And maybe even creating some drills within our own family, creating some, hey, what's the code that we're going to use with each other? Those communications are really important. Watching out afterwards and making sure that we keep an eye on each other. And then the last part that I've heard for sure is making sure that we find purpose afterwards, that we make sense of them in some way to go on and impact others in a positive way, as opposed to just staying in the negative.
Absolutely. I think that's probably one of the most important lessons after something like this.
Very good. Was there anything else that we didn't cover that you wanted to make sure to talk about?
No, I think that we really covered a lot of it, and hopefully this is educational to your listeners. And certainly if there's people that have additional questions or are looking for resources, I'm always happy to chat with people, or they're welcome to send me an email, and I'm happy to point them in the right direction if there's something they need.
Absolutely. How do people get a hold of you if they want to connect with you for more information, or follow you, or keep up with what you're doing?
So on LinkedIn, it's Dr. Katherine Kuhlman. Twitter, I think it's Dr. _K Kuhlman. I'm not sure. Or online at www.drkuhlman.com. And my email is Katherine@drkuhlman.com. So any iteration of Dr. Kuhlman, if you Google it, there'll be plenty of stuff that pops up.
You can find her. Yes. And you are doing some amazing work as far as talking with media and social media. Before we even jumped on, I was talking to her about how she gets thrown these questions, and I'm so amazed at how you handle them, because they're these questions they're asking, like, want you to predict things, and you just gently softball something else to them. And so keep an eye on her. She is going to be somebody in our field and industry that's going to be a spokesperson for all of us. And so show your support to Dr. Kuhlman, and just keep an eye out, follow her on social media, and connect with her if you need to. And if your department needs some more information, she's a great person to contact.
Yeah, always happy. And honestly, it's my honor to be able to advocate for law enforcement and their families. And, I may get in trouble for the things I say on TV sometimes, but it's all worth it.
Totally. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this subject. I really appreciate it.
No,
Until next time,
me.
guys, keep it Code 4.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about the podcast or Cyndi, check out code4couples.com. All intellectual property rights owned by CRLD2 Ventures, LLC, are protected by the firm of 9mm, 45 ACP, 5.56mm, and 12 gauge.